Okay, welcome to week 19, day one. Today we're going to be going from states, props, and components and advancing those by one notch and start talking about use effect. So the main thing that we've done so far is we have learned how to break down a website into components and how to allow those components to preserve some type of data through state and how to share that data between components using props. However, all of that stuff that we talked about can be done without an internet connection, right? I don't need to have to use the internet in order to set up a button or to click a button or to register the number of times I've clicked that button or to display that on a screen. I do, however, need to use the internet if I want that button to connect to an API where when I click that button, something happens. Or I also might need to connect to the internet if I want to run a timer on my website. Like I'm thinking, for example, if you are like trying to reserve a concert ticket, you might need a timer that says, all right, this ticket expires in 15 minutes. Well, you can either have that timer sync up to your computer clock, which is an option, or it can access a clock via the web and sync to that. But how those are all sort of moving pieces of a website. So that's called, we've talked about how to do the static things inside of React. But how do we do something using events where we need to update a React component based off of an external system? And to do that, we end up needing to use something called useEffect. So let's make a sample app in order to do this. So, I don't know. Let's say that we want to make another counter app. We really love using counters as examples because they're honestly just good examples. So let's make another counter. But the last time we made a counter, we had it count based on how many times the user clicked a button. Here, we're going to change it so that it's going to update the page and update the count every time the page refreshes. And we're going to say that the page is going to refresh, I don't know, once a second. So it should, in theory, basically just count like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, dot, 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 every second. So it's basically a very bad but rudimentary timer. So let's figure out how we can do this. So I've started off with a blank app.jsx because I want us to get in the habit of thinking about the main components of a React app. So what's the first thing that I should do to go from blank to making this mysterious app? I'm not pseudocoding.
The export default, just to kind of bring out the body.
Yep, perfect. So export default function app, and that should be it. All right. What are what else should I probably do in terms of general steps that are applicable to every single React component that we make?
Make a return statement. Maybe set it up for putting multiple things inside by empty brackets.
Perfect. There's one thing we're missing.
Import React.
Thank you. Yep, so we're going to import React and we're going to import a couple other things. We're going to bring in our use state. Nope, state. We're also going to import use effect. I'll do that from React. All right, perfect. So let's start thinking about how we want to make this counter thing work. So if we have a counter, presumably we need to figure out how to save whatever thing we're counting. So in order to do that, I might as well use a state to do it because a state is going to be something immutable, which we want for a counter, so it keeps incrementing. And again, remember that the goal of this is to, let me write this down. goal, create a component that refreshes the page every second and counts the number of times a page has been refreshed. Or I guess I should say re-renders is a better word. Re-rendered. There we go. Okay, so let's start by setting up our state. So we can do that by firstly remember that when we're defining a state, you always want to kick it off with const, which specifies const. So we'll specify our state, we can call it like count, and then set count will be our setter function, and we'll create a use state. What should the initial state of our counter probably be? 0, exactly. Because when we first render the page, we've never, I mean, we don't have anything to count from, so might as well start it at 0. The other nice thing about VS Code is, at least in the way that I have it colored, it will color keywords differently from functions, differently from variables. So even though here we are defining, you could call this a tuple, right? Where you have like one thing and then a second thing in the brackets. VS Code knows that count, if I mouse over it, is just a number, right? Or some sort of a variable, which is our state. But it also knows that set count is going to be a function that we run. And we know that's a function because it says up there that it's a react.dispatch.react.setStateAction. Or again, sets count or set state action is something that we run that affects count. So that different coloration can be pretty helpful. And also just end it with a closing semicolon. So let's also just break out our return statement real quick. So I'm just gonna make a nice, very, very simple closing tag. What am I missing? Property assignment. Property assignment. Oh, that's why. I should be doing parentheses instead of curly brackets. There we go. So we'll just say I have rendered this component count times. All right. So if I, for some absurd reason, decide that I want to run this page now, well, let's just do it. Let me find my Chrome. You guys can all see the localhost. That does not work. And anyone guess why it's not working?
You didn't npm run dev.
I did not npm run dev. So we'll do that in the background, getting all green lights. Okay, awesome. We have something that shows up. I'm not seeing any errors up there. I'm not seeing any errors in my console. So the website itself works. Does it do what I want it to do? Or correction, does it do what I intend for it to do at this stage?
No,
Hey, why not?
we haven't told it to do anything. We've only set the state.
Very true. So even though well, it is doing what I told it to do, which is I told it to put something up on the screen, and it's rendered it, and it says I have rendered this component. So in that sense, it's done what I told it to do. However, that's not what we want. We want it to refresh the page every 1 second and re-render it and update the component. In order to do that, that is where we're going to use our use effect. So what is a use effect? Use effect is something called a React hook. And there's a couple of types of this that we'll get into more probably over the next week, where it lets you synchronize a component, in this case our app, with some sort of thing, and I'll use the word thing generally, external to React. So what does that mean? Well, if I want to sync my React up with a timer, that timer is external to React. If I want to integrate my component with an API, that API is external to React. If I want to interact with the DOM, if you guys remember like that document.get.object.get stuff that we did way back when starting to work with HTML and JavaScript, the DOM is outside of React. If I want to interact with that, I need to use a useEffect. Basically, you use useEffect in order to tell React, hey, I know I'm coding in React, but I want to play with something that is not in React. So we'll write our useEffect statement outside of our return and outside of our state. So useEffect is kind of independent. The format of a useEffect is going to be a useEffect, then open and close parentheses. The first thing that you're going to do is you're going to define a function, like what is the thing you want to run. And then the second thing is going to be the dependency. So function is going to be what command do you want to run? Dependency, how often do you want to run? What does this format make you think of? A little bit, in some ways. If anything.
Kind of like the state.
Oh, a little bit like a state. Anything else?
I go a loop.
Kind of. I'm thinking more sort of like an on click or an on action sort of thing. If you guys remember that from when we were dealing with buttons, right? You have like a button and then button on click, you're going to run a function. Kind of similar here, except again, this is just all inside React. And instead of that on blank, do blank way of thinking about it, we're sort of flipping it. And we're saying run this thing whenever something happens. So a dependency, a good example of a dependency could be every render. Right? Every time the page is rendered or the component is rendered, you want to run it, which is dependency is left blank. You can only run it on the first render. So dependency is going to be an empty pair of brackets. So that's like the first time and only the first time that you run the page, that you open the page, you want to do something. You can also make it a variable. So only on the first render and whenever a variable is changed. So dependency there is going to be the variable name in closing bracket. So what does that mean? Well, let's say that I have a state. The state is going to be whether or not a button has been clicked, right? When this button gets clicked, I'm going to change the state of the button. Then once I've changed the state, I can then trigger some useEffect thing to run in the background that plays a YouTube video, that changes the color of the screen, that pulls a joke from an API, that does something. So it's essentially, they're saying like, hey, if it's sort of like that button on click, but now it's way more general. You can take a useEffect and say, hey, if something has changed, I want you to do something else. That's the entire principle of useEffect. Does that make sense, like in theory, before we jump into coding it? Are there any questions about why useEffect is useful?
So just to sum up, you're basically going to have your first part of the use effect is going to be what you want it to do. And the second part is going to be what needs to happen for that function to happen.
Exactly. Any
Would
other
it
questions?
be similar to writing a function inside of a function in a way? So anytime the
Kind
function
of that.
runs also? Okay.
That is effectively what we're doing with a use effect is we will be writing a function inside of it.
Okay.
Any other questions before we actually start coding it out? All right, let's start writing some code. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to define that we're going to use a use effect. Super simple. And now if I open up parentheses, we see that there's two things in our use effect, which is exactly what I told you guys a few minutes earlier. We have the effect, where the effect is going to be a function that this basically means a function that does stuff. The second thing it's going to contain are our dependencies. So let's do let's do the function first. So we'll write a fat arrow function because when we use JavaScript, JavaScript really loves its fat arrow functions. I am not the biggest fan of fat arrow functions, but that is kind of mostly because you don't see fat arrow functions used in other languages much, except a little bit in Python, but they're used kind of for like very simple one-line functions. But again, when we code in a language, we have to respect its norms, no matter how much we may not like them. So we'll start off with a simple useEffects function that's just going to change our counter to go from, count to count plus one. So let's do that part first. So in order to update the counter, can I just do count equals count plus one like that? That should work, right? Sean, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, you got to use the set state, the set count.
Perfect. Yeah, so we're going to do set count, and then we're going to say we can also define yet another fat arrow function there. We'll say count is going to equal that count plus one. So that's going to be the main thing that we want to happen is we want our count to change. However, I don't want the count to change like every like so quickly, right? I don't well actually before I talk about that, let's actually just run the code right now and see what
I have a quick
happens.
question before we go on. For
Yes.
your set count function that's in these use states, does it have to be a function that's in there? Is that what it's listening for?
Yes.
Okay, I think that's what's been
Yeah.
confusing me. Like you can't just put count plus equals one. You have to have a function that's increasing that.
That actually is a good question. We can try it and see.
And it has to be plus
So
equals, I think, right? Because you can't just do count plus one.
let's try it, actually. I think this might work too. Because you can just set it to be a number, I believe. But let's see what happens. So for those who are following along, um, I am going to go back to so now is probably a good time to save it, and we'll switch back. Where's my share screen? To localhost. As we see, the localhost is not working because I stopped my npm run dev, which I always recommend whenever you're making changes to your code base. Kick it off. Again, everything looks green. Well, something sure is working. It looks like it's rendering things a lot faster than once a second, but it is re-rendering it, and the count is updating. So, Sean, I stand corrected. It does look like you can actually just put in count plus one, and it should work.
Okay, and the
So,
reason why it's doing that is because we don't have anything in the dependency section, right? So it's on every render. It's just continuously doing it.
exactly. Yep. So it's just going to
Okay.
keep on continuously doing it until you kill the website. Also, interestingly, you can stop the dev server. So if you kill the dev server but keep the tab open, it will still continue to count up because it doesn't need the dev server in order to do that. So yeah, so basically it's going to do this every single render, and it's just going to keep on continuously re-rendering as much as it wants. Now, I don't want that to happen. So the first thing I want to do is I want to specify that this thing is only going to re-render whenever my count variable changes, right? I don't want it to re-render if another state changes. I want it to only re-render when my count state changes. Next, I only want it to re-render once a second. So how can I specify that I want something to re-render, that I want something to happen after a specific amount of time elapses in JavaScript? Anyone have any ideas or remember? All right, if not, that's totally fine. So there's a function in JavaScript called set timeout, which you may recall, I don't remember if we went over this, but there's a function called set timeout that, as you see here, it's kind of like that useEffect function, where the set timeout function takes two inputs. It takes in a callback, which is basically, hey, what do you want me to run? And it takes in a delay, or how long do you want me to wait in order to run this? And the delay is usually in milliseconds. So the function that I want to run is going to be my set count, and the delay that I want is going to be 1,000 because it's 1,000 milliseconds. 1,000 milliseconds, 1 second. So with this, let's talk through what is going to happen when I run this code. I am first, remember that your useEffect is always going to run on the first render. So I run the page, it opens up. It shows my count is 0. It's going to start with count is 0. Then it's going to say, hang on, my count is, I've already rendered, so I'm going to wait 1 second, then I'm going to update my count to 1. All right, waits a second, updates the count. Wait, hang on. My dependency for the useEffect is on count changing. I just changed the value of count from 0 to 1. All right, time to re-render the component. It's going to re-render it. It's going to run the useEffect again. And it's going to wait 1,000 milliseconds. And then it's going to change count from 1 to 2. Count just changed. Time to re-render it again. And so on and so forth. So hopefully, if everything is coded correctly, we should be able to see that. So let me find React. And that is going way too quickly. So that definitely did not work. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, time to see what I'm missing code-wise. All right, so useEffect, that looks fine. Have a fat arrow, set timeout. 1,000, that's inside here. Let's see if I change this to a fat arrow function. That may make a difference. I really doubt it, but it is possible. And I know that this code works because I was just trying it out, like, right before class to make sure there weren't any significant errors. So import React and useEffect, that looks fine. That looks fine. Okay, let's try this one more time. There we go. Okay, so just for context, oh, I realized I was not sharing my screen when I was making changes in my app.jsx. So we'll get back to that in a second. But the good news is it is now successfully incrementing once a second, which is the original intended goal. So let me go back to app.jsx and we'll talk through what happened and hopefully why. So before, I did not have this as a fat arrow function, right? I only had this as set count and forget that bit. So if you are running your use effect without without a fat arrow function in your set timeout function, it will not work correctly. However, once you add the fat arrow back in, the 1 millisecond delay will kick in. For exactly why, I'm not too sure. So I'm going to do a little bit of digging after. But my hunch is that the set timeout, well, let's mouse over it. Set timeout scheduled execution of a one-time callback. If callback is not a function, a type error will be thrown. So I did not get a type error, but my gut says that it really just wants you to define a function. Even if it's just the function that's running another function, it wants you to define a function in order to run set timeout. So that's my hunch for what's going on. But once we do that, and let me again flip back to fight, and we'll refresh the page. We now see that our component is re-rendering every second. Any questions about how we did that with useEffect? Okay, now there is something interesting that I'd like you guys to take a look at when I refresh the page, and I want to see if anyone can pick up on it. Or, well, actually, it doesn't look like it's happening right now, which is not a bad thing. So, let me see if that will happen if I try this again. Oh, never mind. Okay, that's great. Well, sometimes something interesting can happen when you're using useEffect, especially for re-rendering things like this, which is where instead of it going from 0, 1, 2, etc., it might skip from 0 directly to 2, and it'll skip that first re-render. It's not actually skipping the first re-render, but instead it's not exactly clear. It's scheduling the state update that's in a way that skips some intermediate steps. So if you end up having that happen, which can happen sometimes, or it'll skip a step, there is a way to fix that. However, since my code isn't running into that problem, we can't fix it because it's not running into an issue. This is the one time I'm actually slightly sad that my code is working as intended, but I also don't want to jinx myself, so hopefully it will continue to work as intended for the rest of demo. If it doesn't, we'll figure out what to do then. So, are there any questions about the fundamentals of useEffect before we get to something a little bit more complicated? Okay, great. So, let's talk about something that everybody loves. APIs. More specifically, let's talk about the dad joke API. So, let me pull it up real quick. So, where is my screen share? So, the dad jokes are absolutely terrible. However, they can be funny on occasion. Wouldn't it be so nice, instead of going to this iconhasdadjoke.com, I had a way in order to put this on my lovely formatted React page that are, simple gray and white and it looks nice and I can integrate with other stuff. I really wish there was a way that I could integrate an API from from my browser in my React page. I'm sure everyone else is thinking the exact same thing. And if you are, that's great because React gives us a way to do that. And that is, drumroll, yeah, it's useEffect all over again. So the main utility of useEffect is, for our purposes, is really going to be for linking your React app with APIs. So let's see how the API of this website actually works. The first thing you always want to do is reference the API documentation. And I know you guys have experience with APIs, so I'm not going to belabor the point too much. But one thing that's important to note, the default response format is going to be text HTML. So which of these three formats do we usually like to get our API responses in?
JSON.
JSON, exactly. But if you don't put a accept header, it's going to return an HTML. So this is one thing to remember, because if you try to interpret HTML that you get back as JSON, your code is going to start throwing errors and be like, hey, I'm not seeing JSON, I'm seeing HTML. What's going on? So always make sure to read the documentation carefully, because it'll contain little nuggets like this that are very helpful for pulling your APIs. All right, so in order to pull a random joke, super simple. Just literally need to do get and then the main part of the website. So that shouldn't be too hard to do in React. So what I'm going to do is I am going to, oh, not extensions. Where is, does anyone remember the command for commenting out a large section? I'm briefly forgetting it. I think it's control slash. Never mind. Yeah, I have not.
Control.
On a Mac, it's command /.
Okay, yeah. So it's usually if it's control on Windows, it generally ends up being command on Mac. I also am really curious what the control key on Mac is actually used for, because in my opinion, it seems redundant to have a control and a command key. But that's a conversation for you guys teaching me how to use a Mac as a conversation for off the recording. Okay, so let's start writing our function, our app one more time for this. So let's do that. We are going to have our little return somewhere in there where we're going to do something. So our primary goal here, again, is sort of like with our counter app, is going to be to get a dad joke and display it on the screen every time someone clicks a button. So let's go ahead and grab our button code if I can find it. Let's see if that's in day 2. Perfect. Okay. Now let me go back to my app.jsx and we'll just copy this in. Okay. It's always easier to copy code that you know works from somewhere else and just yoink it back in and then modify it instead of retyping the whole thing. Highly recommend doing that if you know it works and if it is your code or code that you are allowed to copy paste. There are cases that I've seen before where people will just go on the internet randomly and copy paste code that they think looks cool or that works for them, but they don't attribute the source of it. Please, 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 if you are bringing in code from somewhere, just make a simple little comment, that just says code source blankety blank. It makes a big difference, especially if something goes wrong with that code later. So whether that code source is going to be him gave me this code on February 10th, or it could be, random Stack Overflow website. It's really handy for version control is to say where you got stuff from. So this is a modification. So modification of week 18, day 2 button code. So the first thing that I like to do whenever I see code that is not mine is I am always going to go ahead and test if it works or not. So go back to my browser, gonna hit refresh, and I am clicking and it is updating. So, okay, great. So the button code works. That's perfect. I've got a good starting point. So let's keep moving on. So the first thing that I should do now is figure out how I'm going to integrate my joke thing into the app. So let's say generate a joke. We should also, well, if we're going to end up generating a joke, that joke is something that we're going to end up changing, and that joke is going to be a property of the component. So I am going to use state. We'll just make it a, yeah, we'll just make it blank. Actually, we can do something even better. I'll just set it as null, where null is going to be a blank string. So instead of returning the count, because that's a little bit silly, I am just going to return whatever my joke string is. So we should also probably change count to something else, but that's okay. We'll get to that shortly. So every time I click the button, I want to get a joke and re-render the page. So I need a way in order for me to keep track using my useEffect of when my button gets clicked. So let's write this down. So when my button gets clicked, I want to get a new joke and re-render the component with my new joke. So let's change this on click from set count to something else. Now let's change this to like button clicked and then set button clicked. And we'll say that it's false. Right? So what am I doing here? I'm saying when the component is first rendered, the button has not been clicked. So the moment I start the page, I mean, when I go to this website, I haven't clicked the button yet. So obviously, the button should not have been clicked. So I'm going to instead change my on click to say that my button click is now true. The reason I'm doing this is going to be for my useEffect, where my useEffect, again, remember, useEffect has two components, has two parts to it, right? We have the function part, and then we have the dependencies part. So now, because I've set up this relationship between my buttons on click and the state, I can now set the button clicked as a dependency for my useEffect. Does anyone want to remind us what the dependency of a useEffect means? Like, what does this mean? What does the statement I just wrote down mean for us?
Basically, it's waiting for that button click to happen before it runs the function we're going to put into it.
Exactly. So once the button's clicked, a bunch of stuff, whatever we say will happen, should happen, and then it'll get re-rendered. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll set up our fat arrow function here, and let's start figuring out what we want to do in that fat arrow function. So when my button's clicked, I have a couple of things I need to do. Firstly, I need to get a joke from my API. I need to turn joke into a. I need to. Well, that's we'll get there. We need to get the joke out somehow from this API. Then I need to set joke or set joke state to be the joke I get from my API. And then I need to re-render the component to show my new joke. So this is sort of a three-step process. Oh, lastly, there is one more step I'm missing. What might that step be? So I'll give you a hint. What is my use effect dependent on? It's dependent on button clicked. And button clicked is a state. So if I click the button, if when I load up onto the page, the button is originally going to be false. Then when I click the button, it changes to true. When I re-render the
You need to set button clicked inside there then, right?
yes. So what we need to do is we need to set button clicked back to false. So we don't need to make that pseudocode. Let's set that back to false. Why do we want to set it back to false?
It'll keep re-rendering a joke.
Exactly. So that way, the next time that I go, after the first render, it'll wait for me to click the button before it gives me a new joke. Otherwise, if I never change button clicked back to false, it's just going to stay true, right? So if it stays true and I click the button, well, then button clicked has never changed. If button click never changes, my use effect never happens, so I never get a new joke. So this sort of resets the state so that the next time the button is clicked, the state changes, which runs the use effect. And I can also just demonstrate this when we actually write the codes or run the code, so that way you guys can see that as well. Okay, let's start with the first part, getting a joke from my API. So recall, here, let me paste the link in, so that way we have it. So we'll say API, and I'm going to define this up here. API base URL is going to be that. Because this is, oh, well, we don't need all the rest of that actually. Because API links are hard coded. In general, if you are hard coding a variable or a link, it's always a good idea to not to use full uppercase and put it in a special part of your code. So usually you do that with global variables all the way at the top, and you do it in all caps so that you know when you reference it, this is not a normal ordinary variable like X or a counter. This is something special and different that ideally you don't want to change. So we'll just define our API base URL all the way at the top so I can reference it down in here. So now we're going back to our original JavaScript. How do I fetch from an API? Anyone want to get us started? Does anyone remember anything about a promise or an async?
Well, I remember that the async needs to be called first, and then you have the awaits while it's reaching back. I mean, I don't remember the syntax.
Yep, perfect. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up our async. We're going to do, and then we have the awaits. So whenever we are fetching from an API, so fetching from an API is going to have a few components. Going to have wrap everything in an async. Then we need to await fetching the data. And then we need to await turning the data into JSON. Why do we need to await to fetch the data and await to turn the data into JSON? Does anyone remember this?
Because you can't turn the data in JSON until you get the response back.
Exactly. Yep. Again, some APIs will run in like a tenth of a millisecond. Other APIs, if you're reading in a ton of data or the server's slow, it might take you 5 minutes to get a response. You can turn something into JSON way faster than that, or run other operations. So you need to make sure that you've waited for all of the data to get returned to you through your API, because if you don't get all the data back, then whatever you're interpreting is kind of nonsense, and your code might break. So the first thing that we want to do is get the data back from our API. So we can say const, and we can say like joke API data. So now we're going to await, or we're going to fetch. So the format of a fetch, let's see if it'll say anything. Yeah, basically says the same thing. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to specify where we're fetching from. Well, we know we're fetching from our API base URL. And the next thing that we're going to do is we now want to take that API data and we can change that to JSON. So we're going to add in another await. We're going to do joke API data, and we're going to turn this into JSON. We end everything with semicolons just because I like doing it. Now we can, after that, once we've retrieved our joke, the next thing we should do, which will again do it inside of our async. Oops, we did not mean to do that. No, there we go. Okay, hopefully that resizing is complete. So once we have retrieved our joke from via the API, inside of our async, we should probably actually set our joke. So I'm just going to say joke equals joke JSON dot joke. That should be fine, right?
Depends how the JSON is when we get it, right?
This is true. So for that, number one, we can always console log our JSON, which is something I very highly recommend doing. And then number two, well, we'll get there. We'll get there. But yeah, we'll start off with that. Okay, so assuming that our fetching data works, the thing that we actually now need to do is we need to run our function, right? So we need to actually fetch the data. Actually fetch a joke. And it's going to reset the state. And then after that, it should rerender the component to show my new joke after all that's done, once the button's clicked. So again, the use effect, what are we saying here? We're saying whenever my button is clicked, I want to fetch a new joke, wait for it to come in, turn that joke into JSON, print out what that is, set the joke state to be the joke that I see, or that I'm getting back, do all of that, and then reset the button. So I'm not seeing any syntax errors here. And let's go back to React. Gonna spin up my server. And let's see what happens. Interesting. All right, I am getting an error. So this is, now React debugging comes in three flavors. It will tell you what the error is. It will not tell you what the error is, but you'll get an error in your console logs. Or you will not see an error, but what's on your screen is horribly, horribly wrong. Thankfully, we're in the first case, where React directly tells us what the error is. However, it's not fun if I debug it. So, Daryl, would you mind breaking down this error for us and tell us why it happened and maybe how we can fix it?
Well, the warning says this assignment will throw because joke is a constant. So I guess if a variable is a constant, you can't change the value.
So the error is getting thrown right here.
Well, I'm thinking because we're trying to assign joke a value, we should just be using set joke to assign a new value to it.
Exactly. Yes. So this is where set joke or in general, using the set state function is super critical. The nice thing, the benefit of setting up your state with const is if you accidentally try to change the value of your state, like I just did, you will get an error and things will break because you're not supposed to change the value of a state by direct reference. You can only change it using that setter function that we define. So let's change set joke using our setter function and see if we get the same error, which as of right now, I am not seeing. Let's go back to Chrome and let's refresh the page. Cool. I am not seeing a button at all. Definitely what I expected. But let's see. So first of all, let's go through our three-step process that I mentioned. So we'll go to my console. I'm not seeing any errors here. So let me, maybe it's something with the server. Let me rerun the server. Yeah, it's green. I'm not seeing any errors. So, okay, let me refresh the page. Still not seeing a button. Huh. I wonder what went wrong. Let's go to the console. All right. So uncaught reference error. API-based URL is not defined. Okay, so let's go back into my VS Code. Okay, I guess it doesn't like that API-based URL is located outside of my function.
No,
let's
it's because you didn't
that-
say const. You didn't assign it via that.
Thank you. All right. Here, let's try this now. Let me see if my server is still running. Okay, so now I get two new errors. Let's hit refresh. Uncaught in promise, syntax error, unexpected token less than sign, doc type is not valid JSON.
Is that
That's weird.
because you told us at the beginning that this returns HTML unless we do something with the, yeah. There's something extra we need to do.
Header or
Yes.
something,
So
yeah.
so this is where going to the documentation is super duper important. So if we go back to that's all right. There we go. Icon has dad joke, and we go down to the bottom, go to API. As it says right here, the default response is in the HTML format, but we need a JSON response. So let's read the documentation, and this website has good documentation, thankfully. A lot of them will not, so you might have to figure some of this out on your own. So it says all API blah 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 response formatting to be more based on the provided HTTP accept header. So what this reads like to me says that we need to change the accept header in our fetch request. So let's go back to the code and let's figure out how we can do that. So does anyone remember how we can specify a header in a fetch request? All right. It is super simple. All you need to do is curly brackets, headers, colon, and then you specify your headers in another dictionary. So in this case, we only need one header, which is that we're accepting application JSON. So then breaking it down, right, you have your base URL And now we have this other dictionary. This dictionary is going to have some key value pairs. One of those is going to be the headers. And in our headers, we can put in multiple, like we could say like header 2, and then some other parameter, and keep going like that. But if you need to change the headers of a fetch, just create a new dictionary, have the key be headers, and the value is another dictionary that has all the different headers that you need. So let's now go back to the browser, make sure my stuff is still running, and we'll hit F5. Okay, and I don't think I can disagree with that joke. And I'm not seeing any errors in my console. So here's the other nice thing. If you console log your response in JSON, then it will print out your response for you. Now, here's one little fun thing to notice. Well, actually, let me wait and see. Is anyone noticing something interesting happening? No,
Well,
I've only hit the refresh button once.
yeah, it's doing it twice.
Yeah. Why might that be happening?
Oh, it was told to us before. I don't remember personally why.
Anyone want to volunteer some guesses?
I think, doesn't it render it
It's
first?
it was something like you have to set it to like what to do before it renders, while it's rendering, and after it renders, or something like that.
Yep, so there's a couple of different different ways that you can fix it, which let's see. We can get into that shortly. I think before we start thinking about about that part, which I can also probably send some resources about in the chat. That is happening because it's rendering twice. So this will happen quite often when you're working with React, where again, it's going to render things once on the first render, and then secondly, it's going to run it again. Because again, remember, the use effect runs every single render. So it runs on render number 0, and then immediately after that, it'll do it again. Now that's why you get the double render on the first one only. If I click generate a joke, interesting, it continues to do it twice. Well, that's probably why, is because it's re-rendering it and then it's re-rendering it again. But the main crux of the matter is that every time we're running it, it is making that set fetch request successfully, getting it, and then going back. So overall, it looks like our code works. Now, is this code perfect by any means? Definitely not, because of the error that we collectively just found. However, there are some ways around that. So, let's see what the best way to tackle this is. Um, well, we could probably tell it not to fetch if the button has not been clicked. So, you can start there. So, because initially, when we are defining the state is changed because we've defined the state before the state was not defined. So, if the button has not been clicked, then do not re-render. So we could say something like if not button clicked, return. So basically, just don't do anything if I have not clicked the button. I'll start with that. We'll change. See if that mitigates our problem. I'm going to go back to inspect, open my console. Okay. not what I expected, but I think it's because I hit refresh. There we go. So at least now it's only rendering once. However, now on the first render, it's not rendering. So I can continue to hit generate a joke, and it's only going to render it one time. However, again, on the first render, because of the setting that we specified of that if not button clicked return, it's not going to render for us. So we could probably change this to be a use state is true. Oh, and nope, we run into the same error. Well, there is a way around this. I don't want to belabor the point through additional debugging, but make the point that again, if we add in that little if it hasn't been clicked, then exit the use effect, it stops the issue of multiple renderings every time I click, and just one render for one click. There are a couple other ways to do this, I believe, which I'll send after lecture, but lecture's been going on for about an hour, and I'm sure you guys have burning questions about React and about useEffect. So let me flip back over to the VS Code and just ask if are there any questions before I launch into summary and wrap up.
I was trying, but I wasn't able to keep up with what you were typing, so I don't know what to ask at this point.
No worries. Anyone else?
For that, when you say a button is not clicked, I remember there was something, I don't know, is it set in default? Or there's something so the page doesn't render? I can't remember that exact name though, but I think I saw you use it last time. Is it on default or?
Prevent default.
Yeah,
Yep,
prevent,
that's it.
prevent default.
So prevent default does not apply to, I don't remember if it applies to use effect. Maybe it does. But I think that only applies to events.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Is there
'cause
something to
that,
do with development mode? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
oh no, good.
Because
Not sure if
I was
that's
reading just now something about strict mode, and it's recommended to keep it in strict mode in React because it'll mount it, unmount it, and all this stuff while you're in development. And that's why it's rendering twice upon loading initially.
so strict mode is generally, I'm not too sure of all the specifics of it, but strict mode is in general just easier to use because it'll help catch and throw errors more easily than others. Like also for production, or I guess also for dev mode, React will include a lot more warnings in order to help you out. Whereas in production, it sort of silences a lot of the warnings to trim down the user experience. So I'm not too sure if it has something to do with strict mode, but I don't believe it does.
Can we pass anything into the use effect as a parameter?
Not into the use effect itself. Because again, use effect is broken down into those two kind of components. Like you technically, well, now let me backtrack. You are kind of passing in parameters to use effect. Like you're passing in a function that you want to run, and then the dependency, or hey, when do you want me to run this function? So in that sense, you are passing in parameters. However, um, that's that's really about it. You can't pass in anything else to a use effect. You can, however, pass in parameters to the function that you run inside your use effect. Like that's where, in the fat arrow function, those parameters would go in here. But otherwise, you don't pass anything. Any other questions?
Could you scroll down a little bit more, please?
Sure. I'll also copy paste all of this and put it in the Slack too. So real quick, I just want to do before we jump off screen share and sort of just talk things through. I just like to briefly highlight the overall summary of things like useEffects compared to events. So something like I'm going to scroll down a little bit more. On click, or for a form, on submit, though or on mouse over, or on mouse down, or on key, or something like that. All of those on somethings count as events. And the functions that are related to those are known as event handlers. That's sort of where those prevent default actions come in handy. Unlike those, useEffects are dependent on a dependency changing. And when that happens, it will re-render the component in question. So effects and useEffects are related to rendering. Event handlers are related to events. Number two is your useEffect gets run after your page is done rendering. So it'll wrap up after the page is done rendering, and if needed, it will re-render your component as well. So useEffects are created using useEffect, as we said, and as we saw with the API, the main benefit of useEffect is to connect or link or sync, whatever term you'd like to use, your React component with something outside of React, like we did with this API, like you guys will be doing with other APIs that you find for your homework assignment. You could do it with a clock. You could do it with another server, etc. And lastly, again, as we noted, useEffects are dependent on a dependency, aka they only change when something else, they only get run to render when something else changes. And as I noted at the top here, you get to specify when you want that change to occur. Now, ideally, it will only change when you want it to. There are some cases where React breaks and it changes when you don't want it to, but that is where the fun of debugging comes in handy. So with that, that's an overall summary of useEffects. So hopefully that was helpful.